page 14. Evolution: A Theory in Crisis, Michael Denton, 1985. Chapter 1. Genesis Rejected. After having been twice driven back by heavy southwestern gales, Her Majesty's ship Beagle, a 10-gun brig, under the command of Captain FitzRoy, R.N., sailed from Devonport on December 27, 1831. The object of the expedition was to complete the survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, commenced under Captain King in 1826 to 1830 to survey the shores of Chile, Peru, and of some islands in the Pacific and to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements round the world. As the Beagle sailed out of Devonport in December 1831, it could hardly have seemed to those on board that there was anything out of the ordinary or fateful about the voyage ahead. Yet the observations that Darwin was to make during his 5 years aboard the good little vessel, as he affectionately referred to her, were to sow in his mind the seed of the idea of organic evolution. This was a seed which was ultimately to flower in the origin of species into a new and revolutionary view of the living world, which implied that all the diversity of life on Earth had resulted from natural and random processes and not, as was previously believed, from the creative activity of God. The acceptance of this great claim and the consequent elimination of God from nature was to play a decisive role in the secularization of Western society. The voyage on the Beagle was therefore a journey of awesome significance. Its object was to survey Patagonia. Its result was to shake the foundations of Western thought. The philosophy of nature held by Darwin, as he set sail on the Beagle, and by most of his contemporaries, was completely antithetical to the idea of organic evolution. Biology in the early decades of the 19th century was dominated by the idea that the organic world was a fundamentally discontinuous system in which all the major groups of organisms were unique and isolated and unlinked by transitional forms. Species were held to breed true to type, generation after generation, without ever undergoing any significant sort of change. Where there was variation, it was only trivial variation within the clearly defined limits of the species or type. Thus to the naturalists of the 19th century the basic order of nature was static and discontinuous, very different from the dynamic continuous model which was later to become axiomatic for most biologists after 1859. The so-called typological model of nature adhered to by biologists early in the century was not without a considerable degree of empirical support. To anyone observing nature over a short span of time it must have seemed self-evident that species bred to type generation after generation, and that the living world flowed according to a fixed and preordained plan. Moreover, the work of the great 19th century comparative anatomists such as Cuvier and, later, Owen had shown that the living world could be considered divided into distinct types or phyla and that organisms clearly intermediate between different classes were virtually unknown. Comparative anatomy had also revealed that organisms were integrated wholes in which all the components were co-adapted to function together, and this seemed to many to preclude any sort of major evolutionary transformation. As William Coleman, an authority on Georges Cuvier, points out, the organism, being a functionally integrated whole each part of which stood in close relation to every other part, could not, under pain of almost immediate extinction, depart significantly from the norms established for the species by the first anatomical rule. A major change, for example, a sharp increase in the heartbeat or the diminution by half of a kidney and thus a reduction in renal secretion, would by itself have wrought havoc with the general constitution of the animal. In order that an animal might persist after a change of this magnitude it would be necessary that the other organs of the body be also proportionally modified. In other words, an organism must change en bloc or not at all. Only saltatory modification could occur, and this idea was to Cuvier, as it is to most modern zoologists, but for very different reasons, unverified and basically absurd. Transmutation by the accumulation of alterations, great or small, would thus be impossible. The doctrine of the fixity of species was also derived from a great metaphysical system of thought known as essentialism, which presumed, according to Mayer, a broken bar, that the changeable world of appearances is based on underlying immutable essences, and that all members of a class represent the same essence. This idea was first clearly enunciated in Plato's concept of the eidos. Hence the observed vast variability of the world has no more reality, according to this philosophy, than the shadows of an object on a cave wall, as Plato expressed it in his allegory. The only things that are permanent, real, and sharply discontinuous from each other are the fixed, unchangeable ideas underlying the observed variability. Discontinuity and fixity are, according to the essentialist, as much the properties of the living as of the inanimate world. In other words, all individual entities were physical expressions of a finite number of ideal unchanging forms. Applied to the biological sphere, it followed that there were fixed bounds determined by the form of the underlying type beyond which biological variation could not go. Nature was, therefore, fundamentally discontinuous. Typological thinking and the idea of the fixity of species can be traced back in biological thought to Aristotle, who in turn had derived it from the Platonic doctrine of the eidos. For centuries during the Middle Ages, Aristotle's philosophy of nature had been the official doctrine of the Church, and his views still carried great weight among biologists of the early 19th century. The discontinuous typological view of nature was also sanctioned to some extent by religious belief. The religious climate in England when the Beagle sailed in 1831 was very different to that of today. Scientific knowledge was not looked upon as a challenge to religious belief as it was to become after the acceptance of evolution. The discoveries of science, and particularly the magnificently ordered vision of the physical world implicit in the Newtonian synthesis, were all taken as evidence for the existence of a creator and the grandeur of his design. The enormous appeal of natural theology, epitomized by the popularity of William Paley and his famous evidences, illustrates how widespread was the view that science supported theological claims. An indication of how prevalent such thinking was, even among members of the scientific community, is seen in the opening issue of the prestigious Zoological Journal of London, founded in 1824. The editor's introduction in this first issue emphasizes the idea that the study of nature reveals the wisdom of God and indicates the special place occupied by man in the natural order of the world. The naturalist sees the beautiful connection that subsists throughout the whole scheme of animated nature. He traces a mutual depending that convinces him nothing is made in vain. He feels, too, that at the head of all this system of order and beauty, preeminent in the domain of his reason, stands man, the favored creature of his Creator. In the same spirit in 1857, only 2 years before Darwin's origin, one of the leading biologists of North America, Louis Agassiz, at that time professor of zoology at Harvard, could write that the living world shows also premeditation, wisdom, greatness, prescience, omniscience, providence. All these facts proclaim aloud the one God whom man may know, and natural history must, in good time, become the analysis of the thoughts of the Creator of the universe, as manifested in the animal and vegetable kingdoms, as well as in the inorganic world. As far as Darwin's contemporaries were concerned, few felt anything of the conflict between science and religion which is so characteristic of 20th-century thought. The conflict between science and religion only erupted later in the 19th century when it became generally acknowledged that discoveries in geology and biology were incompatible with a literal Genesis. A man of science could still, in the first decades of the 19th century, accept the account of creation in the first book of the Bible as a literal historical description of the origin of the world. There was indeed an element of conflict between the miraculous suspension of natural law that Genesis implied and the increasing success of science in eliminating any need for supernatural explanations, but it was perceived to be minimal. Genesis rejected, page 21. But although biblical literalism was not yet in open conflict with scientific knowledge, it undoubtedly had a constraining effect on geological and biological thought throughout the 18th and the first part of the 19th centuries. Coleman has written of those times. Many naturalists were strongly influenced by the seeming necessity of finding in nature the literal realization of the event catalogued in divine scripture. On many issues of natural history, and particularly that of the nature of the biological species, it was commonly believed that the Bible was to be either the final authority or at least a repository of general truths of which none could be safely or legitimately disregarded by a truly philosophical naturalist. While it is difficult from this distance to judge just how much influence the belief in a literal Genesis had on the great naturalists of the first decades of the 19th century, it was undoubtedly considerable. For example, it was almost certainly the major factor responsible for the widespread belief in a 6,000-year-old Earth, and the doctrine of the fixity of species seemed to be supported by statements in Genesis which appeared to imply that species had been created after their kind and bred true to type. But there were an increasing number of observations, particularly geological, that were difficult to reconcile with the Mosaic account. It was increasingly obvious to most geologists that none of the known natural processes, such as water or wind erosion, could have shaped the Earth's surface in a mere 6,000 years. These processes cause virtually no perceptible change even over centuries, yet the book of Genesis implied that the Earth had been created in the relatively recent past, only 6,000 years ago, according to some biblical chronologists. Another challenge to the traditional account was the discovery that many species which had once lived on the Earth had become extinct. The biblical deluge could not have been responsible for the extinctions of all these ancient life forms, because Genesis implied that every species was rescued from the flood. To complicate this problem, there was some evidence that the Earth may have been populated by a whole succession of very different faunas. The degree to which religious belief influenced leading 19th-century biologists such as Cuvier, Owen, Lionel and others has probably been exaggerated. Second discussion in Chapter 5. In an attempt to reconcile this new knowledge with the biblical story, a compromise was proposed in the theory of catastrophes, which supposed that the history of the Earth had been periodically interrupted by great cataclysms of supernatural origin, causing sudden massive changes to the surface of the Earth. Following each catastrophe, it was believed that the Earth had been repopulated by newly created species. As Cuvier expressed it, life in those times was often disturbed by these frightful events. Numberless living things were victims of such catastrophes. Some, inhabitants of the dry land, were engulfed in deluges. Others, living in the heart of the seas, were left stranded when the ocean floor was suddenly raised up again, and whole races were destroyed forever, leaving only a few relics which the naturalist can scarcely recognize. Evidence for catastrophes was found in all kinds of geological phenomena: seashells on mountain tops, vast alluvial beds of gravels and clays, the sudden extinction and subsequent freezing of such prehistoric species as the mammoth, massive heaps of bones of extinct species found in caves and various localities, large blocks of stone which clearly had been carried from distant sources and dropped in their present location. Even the carving out of river valleys was put down to the action of catastrophic deluges, and the thrusting up of mountain chains was similarly considered to have resulted from cataclysmic upheavals. Catastrophism was essential if the vast geological changes which must have occurred in the past were to be accounted for in the short time span implied by a literal interpretation of Genesis. Catastrophism did not reconcile geology with Moses quite as satisfactorily as some might have wished. The Bible made no mention of catastrophes which could have eliminated prehistoric life preceding the creation of man, and it was difficult to see how such events could have occurred within the short space of 6 days. One way out of this dilemma was to propose, as Cuvier did, that each day was a period of indefinite length, thus allowing ample time for the occurrence of catastrophes. Another popular stratagem was to propose that the 6 days creation was not an account of the original creation of the world but rather a description of God's activity in restoring and repopulating the earth following the last great cataclysm which preceded the flood of Noah. According to Thomas Chalmers, a leading apologist of the period, Moses may be supposed to give us not a history of the first formation of things, but the formation of the present system, and as we have already proved the necessity of direct exercises of creative power to keep up the generations of living creatures, so Moses may, for anything we know, be giving us the full history of the last great interposition, and be describing the successive steps by which the mischiefs of the last catastrophe were repaired. All in all, the scientific community was still wedded to the cosmology of Genesis and to a belief in the literal historicity of Scripture. There were, of course, arguments over various details. Not everyone agreed as to how many catastrophes had occurred or which particular geological phenomena could be attributed to the flood of Noah and which to previous catastrophes. There were also disagreements as to whether new species had been created as an original pair or whether several pairs had been created simultaneously. Another source of discussion was the way in which different animal species had reached remote regions of the globe after the flood. The existence of these disputes again serves to illustrate the theological orientation of the natural sciences in this period and emphasizes the enormous intellectual gulf that separates their outlook from the secular ethos of today. It is extraordinary to think that a little over 100 years ago the majority of biologists and geologists felt completely at ease intellectually with a view of the past which necessitated innumerable miraculous or supernatural events. The consensus in favor of Genesis was not quite universal, however. There was a minority of dissenters who questioned the established position and whose views were, as it turned out, a foreshadowing of the intellectual upheaval that was shortly to come. The possibility of the transmutation of species had been considered by the French biologist Buffon in the mid-18th century and later by another French biologist, Lamarck. Even Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had toyed with the idea of evolution in his major work Zoonomia. Both catastrophism and the idea of a 6,000-year-old Earth were also being questioned by a minority of geologists. Already in the 18th century the Scottish geologist Hutton had presented an alternative uniformitarian interpretation of geological phenomena, arguing that the geological appearance of the Earth could be readily accounted for by small changes which were occurring continually, uninterrupted over vast periods of time. Shortly before Darwin set sail on the Beagle, the preeminent exponent of uniformitarianism, Charles Lyell, published the first volume of his great work Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. Lyell's work ultimately proved a watershed in geological thought and convinced most scientists, including Darwin, of the validity of uniformitarianism, but at the time of publication it was still greatly considered heretical by the majority of geologists. Thus, despite the existence of such straws in the wind, the overwhelming consensus among biologists was in favor of catastrophism and a recent Earth, and the special creation of each and every species as a fundamentally immutable entity. Darwin was born into a well-to-do middle-class English family at the turn of the 19th century. His father was a Shropshire doctor who gave his son the typical education of his class. He was on his own admission a rather below average and more interested in shooting and sport than in drilling Greek and Latin verbs. From school Darwin went to study medicine at Edinburgh, at that time one of the leading medical schools in Europe, but the subject bored him, so his father, fearing that he might turn into an idle sporting man, sent him to Cambridge to study theology, intending him eventually to settle as a country clergyman. Nothing we know of Darwin at this time suggests that he was in any way exceptional or unconventional. There is no hint of the intellectual revolutionary he was later to become. In his own words, "During the 3 years which I spent at Cambridge my time was wasted, as far as the academical studies were concerned, as completely as at Edinburgh and at school a broken bar. There were, however, some pointers towards a career in the biological sciences. Throughout his youth he had been interested in natural history. As a boy he had collected insects, and later, at Cambridge, he made a serious hobby of entomology and made a few minor contributions to the field. Also, despite his confession to being a wastrel at Cambridge, there must have been a lot more to Darwin than a passion for writing and hunting. He befriended there some of the foremost intellectuals in the natural sciences, such as Professor Henslow, with whom he used to take long walks, earning for himself the title "the man who walks with Henslow." Through Henslow Darwin came in contact with Professor Sedgwick, one of the dominant figures in British geology at that time. Neither of these two men nor any of his other mentors were unconventional in any way. Nearly all were creationists and catastrophists who accepted a literal interpretation of Genesis. Darwin seems to have imbibed the conventional wisdom of his tutors. Both before and even shortly after having joined the Beagle, Darwin was a Bible-quoting fundamentalist and a believer in the special creation and fixity of each species. I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible. Whilst on board the Beagle I was quite orthodox, and I remember being heartily laughed at by several of the officers, though themselves orthodox, for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality. For Darwin the Beagle proved the turning point of his life, a liberating journey through time and space which freed him from the constraining influence of Genesis. Every voyage conjures up a vision of new horizons and emancipation, but there is something particularly evocative about the voyage of the Beagle to the remote and little-known shores of South America. It is almost as if the elemental forces of nature, so apparent along those cold and stormy coasts of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, had conspired together to fragment the whole framework of biblical literalism in Darwin's mind, to blow his intellect clear of all the accumulated cobwebs of tradition and religious obscurantism. The Beagle is also symbolic of the much greater voyage which the whole of our culture subsequently made from the narrow fundamentalism of the Victorian era to the skepticism and uncertainty of the 20th century. Darwin's experiences during those liberating 5 years became the experience of the world. It was Darwin's geological observations on the Beagle which first sowed seeds of doubt in his mind as to the historicity of the Genesis account of creation. We know that Darwin had Lyell's Principles of Geology with him on the voyage and that it exerted a powerful influence on his thinking as the journey progressed. In Patagonia, while following the course of the Santa Cruz River, he considers the forces responsible for the carving out of a steep-sided canyon from the hard basalt rock and records in his journal. What power, then, had removed along a whole line of country, a solid mass of very hard rock, which had an average thickness of nearly 300 feet, and a breadth varying from rather less than 2 miles to 4 miles. The river, though it has so little power in transporting even inconsiderable fragments, yet in a lapse of ages might produce by its gradual erosion an effect of which it is difficult to judge the amount. But in this case, independently of the insignificance of such an agency, good reasons can be assigned for believing that this valley was formerly occupied by an arm of the sea. Geologists formerly would have brought into play the violent action of some overwhelming debacle. But in this case such a supposition would have been quite inadmissible, because, the same step-like plains with existing seashells lying on their surface, which front the long line of the Patagonian coast, sweep up on each side of the valley of Santa Cruz. No possible action of any flood could thus have modeled the land, either within the valley or along the open coast, and by the formation of such step-like plains or terraces the valley itself has been hollowed out. Although we know that there are tides which run within the narrows of the Strait of Magellan at the rate of 8 knots an hour, yet we must confess that it makes the head almost giddy to reflect on the number of years, century after century, which the tides, unaided by a heavy surf, must have required to have corroded so vast an area and thickness of solid basaltic lava. He must have had many similar experiences, as he explored the southern tip of South America, which would have made him skeptical of the theory of catastrophes and of the 6,000-year time scale, and increasingly inclined to a uniformitarian view. In another section of his journal he reflects on the uplifting of the mighty Andes. Who can avoid wondering at the force which has upheaved these mountains, and even more so at the countless ages which it must have required, to have broken through, removed, and leveled whole masses of them? Darwin's theory of coral reef formation, which he worked out while still on the west coast of South America, is further evidence that he had rejected the 6,000-year-old Earth and was already, 18 months before he returned to England, a convert to Lyell's theory. Coral grows very slowly and will only grow at a depth of about 20 feet below the surface of the sea, yet in some parts of the world vast reefs have been built up, some of them several hundred feet in height, reaching from the ocean floor to a few feet below the surface, consisting of myriads upon myriads of shells of minute and long dead coral polyps. Darwin noted that they were invariably found in regions where either land subsidence had occurred or where there was strong circumstantial evidence that it had probably occurred. He argued that if land subsided sufficiently slowly, then the reef could grow upwards at the same rate, and over a course of an unimaginable span of time an immense reef, perhaps several hundred feet in depth, could be gradually built up. Such a process would require that geological change, in this case land subsidence, occurred very gradually and over immense spans of time, and these two axioms, gradualism and an immense time span, were the two fundamental pillars upon which the whole uniformitarian thesis of geology was based. The twin concepts of gradualism and immense time are also crucial to the idea of biological evolution and, as many biologists later acknowledged, geological uniformitarianism, more than anything else, eased the way for their acceptance of evolution. Whether Darwin himself made the transition while on board the Beagle is difficult to assess from his own writings. Precisely when he came to believe in evolution, whether it was a gradual dawning, or a sudden realization, we will probably never know. What is certain, however, is that the biological observations he made on the voyage, particularly those relating to geographical variation, played a crucial role in the development of his evolutionary thinking. The one aspect of geographical variation which more than any other seemed to challenge the concept of the fixity of species was the fact that different geographical regions were often populated by quite distinct, yet closely related, species. Only a few months after leaving England, the Beagle was bringing Darwin face to face with many striking examples of this phenomenon. After making a short expedition into the Brazilian jungle, he recorded in his journal, "I never return from these excursions empty-handed. This day I found a specimen of a curious fungus, called Hymenophalus. Most people know the English phallus, which in autumn taints the air with its odious smell. This, however, as the entomologist is aware, is to some of our beetles a delightful fragrance. So was it here, for a strong linus, attracted by the odor, alighted on the fungus as I carried it in my hand. We here see in two distant countries a similar relation between plants and insects of the same families, though the species of both are different." Such observations present an obvious challenge to the doctrine of the fixity of species, and this must have been perceived by Darwin. A number of questions automatically arise. Were such clearly related species really created separately in Europe and South America, as a rigid application of the fixity of species would imply, or had they gradually diverged by natural processes from a common stock as they migrated to their present geographical locations? If they had diverged, would there have been sufficient time in 6,000 years for the degree of change to occur? Darwin must have had serious doubts as to the validity of the fixity of species before he reached the Galapagos Islands, but it seems as if the observations he made there finally provided him with irrefutable evidence that the species was not an immutable entity, and this was his moment of truth from which there could be no turning back. Ahead lay the intellectual path to evolution and ultimately the origin of species. Darwin, unfortunately, left no record of his exact state of mind over the question of evolution while he was on the Galapagos Islands, but we know that in retrospect he judged the experiences he had there to be the origin of all my views. The Galapagos archipelago consists of 13 small volcanic islands situated on the equator about 600 miles west of the coast of South America. The largest is only 70 miles long and only 20 miles wide at its broadest point, while some of the smaller islands are no more than a few square miles in area. The majority of the islands are less than 60 miles apart. The archipelago is not a particularly attractive backdrop for the enactment of a decisive intellectual drama. As Darwin records his first impressions of one of the main islands of the group, nothing could be less inviting than the first appearance. A broken field of black basaltic lava, thrown into the most rugged waves and crossed by great fissures, is everywhere covered by stunted, sunburned brushwood, which shows little signs of life. The dry and parched surface, being heated by the noonday sun, gave to the air a close and sultry feeling, like that from a stove. We fancied even that the bushes smelt unpleasantly. Although I diligently tried to collect as many plants as possible, I succeeded in getting very few, and such wretched-looking little weeds would have better become an Arctic than an equatorial flora. But if the physical appearance of the remote islands was uninviting, the natural history of the archipelago was, in Darwin's own words, eminently curious and well deserves attention, as the islands were populated by a remarkable number of unique and unusual plant and animal species. As Darwin recorded in his journal, these included at least 100 species of flowering plants, dozens of insect species, and nearly 30 species of bird. Also found only on the archipelago were a unique species of giant tortoise and 2 closely related species of lizards, one terrestrial and the other, the remarkable marine iguana, uniquely specialized for feeding on seaweed, possessing partially webbed feet and the capacity to remain submerged for prolonged periods of time. One of the most intriguing aspects of the fauna of the Galapagos Islands was the way many of the organisms such as the tortoises, the iguanas, the mocking thrushes and many of the plants varied from island to island, and in some cases this variation was so marked that individual island forms had every appearance of being quite distinct species. It was the existence of so many distinct, yet intimately related, species scattered on the islands of the archipelago which planted the idea of organic evolution in Darwin's mind. As he noted in his journal, the distribution of the tenants of this archipelago would not be nearly so wonderful, if, for instance, one island had a mocking thrush, and a second island some other quite distinct genus, if one island had its genus of lizard, and a second island another distinct genus, or none whatever, or if the different islands were inhabited, not by representative species of the same genera of plants, but by totally different genera. But it is the circumstance that several of the islands possess their own species of the tortoise, mocking thrush, finches, and numerous plants, these species having the same general habits, occupying analogous situations, and obviously filling the same place in the natural economy of this archipelago, that strikes me with wonder. The possibility that the closely related species on the different islands had descended with modification, or evolved, from a common ancestral species which originally inhabited the islands, was very difficult to resist. Was it really possible, as a strict application of the doctrine of the fixity of species implied, that individual species had been specifically created for tiny islands, some of which were in Darwin's own words hardly more than 8 points of rock? As he wrote in his journal, one is astonished at the amount of creative force, if such an expression may be used, displayed on these small, barren, and rocky islands, and still more so, as its diverse yet analogous action on points so near each other. In his ornithological notes composed while on board the Beagle, perhaps even shortly after he left the Galapagos Islands, Darwin gives us a glimpse into his own mind, where the idea of evolution was clearly beginning to dawn. Commenting on the inter-island variation he had just witnessed, he remarked, "The zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species. Of all the animals unique to these remote islands, perhaps none are more famous than a group of small land birds now known to the world as A. Darwin's finches. Altogether there are 14 different species of finches on the Galapagos Islands, which differ so greatly in size, plumage, beak morphology and behavior that were they to visit an average suburban garden they would be classed unhesitatingly as distinct species. The largest finch is about the size of a blackbird, while the smallest is close to a sparrow. Each has a distinctive plumage. In some it is almost completely black, while in others it is light brown. The shape of the beak varies markedly between the species. Some have small finch-like beaks, others parrot-like beaks, another group have slender warbler-like beaks, some of which are specially decurved for flower probing. One species even has a straightwood boring beak. The variation in beak morphology reflects fundamental differences in feeding habits and general behavior. Some species, those with heavily built finch or parrot-like beaks, the ground finches, are seed and cactus eaters, and spend most of their time hopping about on the ground. The species with long slender beaks, the tree finches, are largely insectivorous and spend much of their time tit-like among the branches of the trees. One species, the woodpecker finch with a straight wood-boring beak, climbs woodpecker-like vertically up tree trunks and has invented the remarkable technique of inserting a cactus spine into crevices in search of insects. The warbler finch has a long slender beak and not only exhibits the quick flitting movements of a warbler as it darts among the branches searching for insects, but also like a warbler repeatedly flicks the wings partly open when hopping among the bushes. Although differing in coloration, beak morphology, feeding habits and size, the 14 species of Galapagos finches are undoubtedly closely related. All the species, for example, exhibit exactly the same display and song pattern, and all belong to the same subfamily of finches. So here on this isolated archipelago was a unique set of distinct finches so closely related that some of them could be arranged into an almost perfect morphological sequence in terms of beak morphology, size and plumage. The idea that they were all related by common descent from an original ancestral species, in other words that new species had arisen from pre-existing species in nature and that, therefore, species were not the fixed immutable entities most biologists supposed, seemed irresistible. As Darwin wrote, "Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." In addition to the remarkable interspecies variation within the archipelago, another aspect of the natural history of the islands which lent further circumstantial support to the concept of evolution and mitigated greatly against the doctrine of the fixity of species was the very suggestive observation that despite the uniqueness of the fauna of the Galapagos, most of the species there were obviously, if distantly, related to sister species on the nearest continental landmass, the South American mainland some 600 miles to the east. Commenting on the relationship, Darwin wrote in his journal, "If this character were owing merely to immigrants from America, there would be little remarkable in it, but we see that a vast majority of all the land animals, and that more than half of the flowering plants, are aboriginal productions." It was most striking to be surrounded by new birds, new reptiles, new insects, new plants, and yet by innumerable trilling details of structure, and even by the tones of voice and plumage of the birds, to have the temperate plains of Patagonia, or the hot dry deserts of northern Chile, vividly brought before my eyes. Explaining why the fauna on this isolated archipelago should bear the unmistakable impression of South America in terms of creationism and the fixity of species seems to lead to highly implausible conclusions. Why, on creationist reasoning, should the fauna of the Galapagos Islands resemble the fauna of South America and not, for example, the fauna of the Cape Verde Islands, which are far closer in climate, geology, and general characteristics? In Darwin's own words, why, on these small points of land, which within a late geological period must have been covered by the ocean, which are formed of basaltic lava, and therefore differ in geological character from the American continent, and which are placed under a peculiar climate, why were their aboriginal inhabitants, associated, I may add, in different proportions both in kind and number from those on the continent, and therefore acting on each other in a different manner, why were they created on American types of organization? It is probable that the islands of the Cape de Verde group resemble, in all their physical conditions, far more closely the Galapagos Islands than these latter physically resemble the coast of America, yet the aboriginal inhabitants of the two groups are totally unlike those of the Cape de Verde Islands, bearing the impress of Africa, as the inhabitants of the Galapagos archipelago are stamped with that of America. This phenomenon was not restricted to the Galapagos Islands. To any well-traveled naturalist it is immediately apparent that in different continents similar environments are generally occupied by quite different unrelated species, and that adjacent geographical regions within any one great continental area are generally populated by different, yet basically related, forms. Why had God not created the same species for the same environments even if these environments did occur in widely separated geographical regions? Perhaps creation had proceeded according to some geographical rule which demanded that only closely related species be created within any one great region of the earth. Or had the curious pattern of geographical variation resulted from some sort of directed migration following the deluge? Such questions were bound to have occurred to Darwin while still on board the Beagle, and they must inevitably have had the effect of rendering the biblical framework increasingly obsolete in his mind. Once it was accepted that new species could arise in nature by descent from pre-existing species, as seemed to have occurred within the Galapagos archipelago itself, many of the facts of geographical variation could be readily explained. The close relationship between the fauna of the Galapagos and South America, for example, could then be easily accounted for by envisaging, firstly, a number of original chance colonizations of the islands from the South American mainland, and secondly, their subsequent evolutionary diversification into various new species as they spread gradually throughout the archipelago. In many such instances Darwin must have found the evolutionary explanation far more plausible than its creationist rival. Altogether, many of the facts of geographical variation were very difficult to reconcile with the doctrine of the fixity of species, and later, in a much-quoted letter to Joseph Hooker on 11th of January, 1844, Darwin made his famous confession. I was so struck with the distribution of the Galapagos organisms, c. and with the character of the American fossil mammifers, that I determined to collect blindly every sort of fact, which could bear any way on what are species. At last gleams of light have come, and I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, it is like confessing a murder, immutable. He was not the only Victorian naturalist whose faith in the fixity of species was shaken by travel and, particularly, by contact with the facts of geographical variation in isolated regions. Lyell, whose book had such an influence on Darwin's geological thinking, but who resisted the idea of organic evolution for many years, first felt the impact of Darwin's argument when he too had been exposed to the phenomenon of geographical variation on the Canary Islands. Similarly, Alfred Russel Wallace, who subsequently read with Darwin their famous joint paper to the Linnean Society in 1858 proposing the theory of evolution by natural selection, first became an evolutionist when he became acquainted with the facts of geographical variation in Malaya and in the Indonesian islands. Genesis rejected 35. The Beagle revealed to Darwin a new world, one that bore no trace of the supernatural drama that Genesis implied, and one which seemed impossible to reconcile with the miraculous biblical framework he himself had accepted when he left England. All the new evidence seemed to point to an immensely long geological past, and nowhere could he see evidence of supernatural catastrophes or interventions interrupting the course of nature. The doctrine of the fixity of species was contradicted by the sorts of observations he had made on the Galapagos Islands, which suggested strongly that species did in fact change under the agency of entirely natural processes. Although nothing that Darwin had witnessed on the Beagle implied that evolution on a grand scale had occurred, that the major divisions of nature had been crossed by an evolutionary process, the old typological discontinuous view of nature seemed far less credible. This was not only because the species barrier, one of the supposedly fundamental divisions of nature, had apparently been breached in places like the Galapagos Islands, but also because in Darwin's mind and in the minds of many 19th-century biologists, typology was closely associated with the whole supernatural biblical framework, with its emphasis on a recent earth, on the miraculous and special creationism, a framework which was frankly non-scientific and irreconcilable with the fundamental aim of science to reduce wherever possible all phenomena to purely natural explanations. Page 32.